this apparently people are very much interested in the Russian oils and Russian money, but not in Russian revolution. It happens. But I'm so pleased to have a certain small-scale seminar, though small-scale, dedicated to the centennial of the Russian Revolution in Seoul. Actually, still I remind myself about those young days in 1980s when we thought Moscow will be an alternative to the wild capitalism or such a forced modernization under the military dictatorship, but it didn't need just even less than a decade we could recognize, that was our dream, and then this just reconstructed, certainly imagined the Russia, a socialist Russia in our imagination, and the reality was totally different from this. But I think that today's workshop may draw our attention to the sort of, hopefully a sort of balanced interpretation and balanced view to the Russian Revolution. And actually, on the one hand, we cannot just, lose our sense of the hope that people had kept on the eve of revolution or afterwards. And on the other hand, also, we should not divert our sympathy, empathy towards revolution from the reality of how this really existing socialism has been degenerated in the course of history. But we have today 4 speakers, and our first speaker is Choi Chatterjee, and she recently still editing 3 volumes of Wide Arc of Revolution, Global History of 1917. It was actually, the book project was designed to commemorate centennial of Russian Revolution among the Russian history experts, mainly in the United States and Britain, but also you included some historians from the other part of the world. So Wide Arc of Revolution, under that title, and the Choi Chatterjee and her colleagues really tried to put a sort of transnational approach or a global historical approach to the Russian Revolution in 1917. So, Choi, thank you very much for coming, and the mic is yours.
Well, thank you everybody, and thank you for letting us have this workshop here, Humanist Books. Thank you to Ji Hun Lim for inviting me, and Xiang Dan for making such wonderful arrangements, and all the colleagues over here. So when I was writing this talk, I wrote it for the graduate students, not really for my colleagues, because I think my colleagues have a good idea about what I'm going to say. But I thought for graduate students, sometimes historiography is very mystifying, right? You're asked to master, so-and-so said this, so-and-so said this, so-and-so said this. You don't know the conversation that we have as scholars, and so I tried to make this useful. So I hope this talk will be useful. And Ji-Hun, how much time do I have?
40 minutes.
40 minutes, yeah. Okay, excellent. So in November 2017, as we look back 100 years of the Russian Revolution, a clearer picture is beginning to emerge. Some of the political passions of the Cold War made this a very fraught and difficult history to study, especially in the United States, where Russia was seen as the enemy. I think British scholars had much more objectivity than the European scholars, but in the United States, definitely the way that it was understood was Russia as the enemy. That was my training. But the more I think about it, some revolutions in history, the French, maybe the Spanish, the Iranian, the Chinese, the Russian, these are world historical events. These are not national events, these are not imperial events, these are events that have echoed around the world. And so the last part of my talk, I will focus on the global impact. But before I get there, I will of course draw from these volumes that I'm editing along with 3 other colleagues. We are doing 23 volumes on Russia's Great Revolution, and 3 of them are on the wider arc. So this is a huge global project. And then from my own book that I'm writing called Russia and World History. So for the sake of my audience, I'm going to go through the 4 frames that we customarily use to understand this revolution. And once I go through those 4 frames, I think it will then make more sense as to why I think studying the global impact has a way to change the way we understand the Russian Revolution. Right? So I start with, so I'm going through the political, the social, the cultural, the imperial frame of analysis, and then I will end with the global impact of the Russian Revolution. So the political frame has 3 distinct formulations. The very early studies of the Russian Revolution was hinged on these 2 ways of understanding. One was the Bolsheviks was a coup d'etat, it was illegitimate, it was illegal, it was something that was done in contravention of the history of Russia. Russia was heading towards some kind of democracy after the February Revolution, and the Bolsheviks hijacked it, right? And this view was very popular among the Russian diaspora, right? Elite emigre members who left the Soviet Union or were kicked out, and some of their sons and daughters who taught at very elite universities, especially in the US and in Europe, and they were fiercely anti-Soviet. And so in a weird way, this was a Russian view from abroad, which then became very useful for American foreign policy makers because it fit perfectly into the emerging Cold War narrative, right? So in a weird way, anti-Soviet Russian nationalists created the dialogue that American foreign policy makers were going to use. And, and we see this a lot. The Iranian Revolution, for example, a lot of the discourses were generated by very hardline, right-wing Iranian expatriates living in the West, right? Now, this kind of approach then became systematized with the totalitarian school of historiography. So after the Second World War, a lot of scholars in the West realized that Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were fairly similar. They all, they both had one terrible leader, they had a propaganda state, they had mass politics, right? And they tried to recreate a brand new society. And this was a very fruitful arena because Nazi Germany was an ex-defeated power, and the Soviet Union was the enemy, right? So it was very good to put the 2 enemies in the same frame. Again, this was a very, very political frame of analysis. Now, my own advisor, Alexander Rabinovich, it's so interesting because his father was this famous Russian scientist. He was part of this very elite diaspora in the United States, and he was the one who sort of broke the storyline, right? And so he argued, and his book was immensely revisionist and immensely popular and immensely contested because his book, when the Bolsheviks came to power, he talked about the fact it was not a coup, it was not a power grab, it was not illegitimate, but in November 1917, Leninist slogans of peace, land, and bread were the popular demands. So the Bolsheviks, he argued, were very clever politicians who got over their own ideological baggage and tried to make a revolution that was in accordance with the popular wishes. Now, when Alex's book was published in the 60s, it created a furor, and the Russian emigres were very angry that someone had betrayed us, but who had betrayed, right? Their own son, right? So there were people who stopped talking to him, there were people who stopped talking to his family. He faced a lot of pressure, but his book, and then he's subsequently gone on to publish 2 more books on 1917, he's now working on 1918, sort of set the basis for what we then call revisionist scholarship in the US, right? So not looking just at the big names, the Lenin and the Trotsky and the Zinoviev and the Kamenev, right? So, but looking at maybe the people from below who played a role in revolution. Now, this political understanding of the Russian Revolution has then been expanded, and more recently, Peter Holquist, Joshua Sanborn, David Hoffman, Peter Gaprell in England, these people have argued that why do we frame the political only as personalities and ideologies, right? That's a very narrow definition of politics, right? And so what these scholars are talking about, and they're very influenced by Foucault, Zygmunt Bauman, and they are talking about the practices of modernity, right? So political statecraft as a set of practices. And their work is very fruitful because firstly, they're a little bit comparativist, not global, but at least they're looking at Western Europe. And what they're finding is that during this period, First World War, all combatants expended horrendous violence on civilian populations, right? This is, for European wars tended to be, since Napoleon, Europe had never had a sustained 4-year war, right? The colonial victories were easy wars, right? They're superior arms. So when you're fighting the Mahdi in Sudan, or you're fighting in Burma, these are not real wars. But the First World War set in motion this hideous, ongoing civilian catastrophe, right? And so these scholars argue that the Soviets, many of the techniques that they learned about violence, about surveillance, these were things that the Europeans learned in the First World War. So this is a very fruitful approach to consider. And finally, the political understanding of 1917 has also been enriched by the works of people like Boris Kolonitsky, Edward Burjalov, Paul Averick, Barbara Allen, Oliver Radke, and these are people, and there are many other names, I can't go through all the names, but these are people who are looking at other political parties, right? The Socialist Revolutionaries, who were, by any accounts, when the votes were counted in the Constituent Assembly, they had just scored the highest number of votes. And Jiva Galili, looking at the anarchists, the Mensheviks, the workers' opposition, and looking at these other political framings. Now, it's very important, the work of Burjalov and Kolonitsky is particularly important because they have looked at February, right, the other revolution. We always think of November, but there were 2 revolutions in 1917. And what these 2 scholars have really explored is the liberal democratic potential of the Russian Revolution, right? So this is a lost history, and their work is, I think, very important politically in Russia today, because Boris Kolonitsky is really a very, very fine scholar. Now, since 1991, another political discourse has emerged, and Raspen in Russia has published enormous amounts of material on the white Russians, right? The Russian emigres. And so all the people who we academics didn't want to touch, right? Because these are, some of the white generals were not very nice people. But in Russia, there's so much nostalgia for this other Russians, or Russians abroad, that we have this flood of publication on white generals, commanding officers, a sort of obsession with the white army. And I felt I had to mention it because this is very much a state-sponsored project, right? So it's not what I would call history, but we have to acknowledge that the discourse is there. And some British authors, Orlando Figes, Matthew Rendell, Paul Robinson, they've also been working on the White Army. And Douglas Smith, an American scholar, recently published a big book on the aristocracy. And so there's some kind of imperial nostalgia, right, for the Russian nobility, for the imperial court, which was a dazzling court, for the country estates, right? So Russia had this very Europeanized nobility, and so there's a lot of nostalgia in Russia and outside to sort of bring back those voices, which were not always politically progressive. So turning to the social, which was another huge area of historiography where a lot of work has been published. And again, I'm just going to mention a few names. Alan Wildman, Keep, British author Steve Smith, I must say, a British author at Oxford who's done wonderful, wonderful work on the workers of Petrograd. And more recently, Don Rowley, who's working in the provinces, Sarah Babcock, another British author, Aaron Reddish, and Igor Narsky, this Russian historian who's done most amazing work on the revolutionary impact in Siberia. And what they have done is sort of break this obsession with Petrograd and Moscow, right? Because that's all we seem to care about. And they're like, it's a huge empire with 11 time zones. What was happening elsewhere, right? And how does this story from the periphery change the narrative at the center, right? So the social is a very important way to understand the revolution. There's the everyday life dimension, but there is a political argument that's going on, right? Because these people are saying that, yes, the army fell apart But the army did not fall apart. Soldiers were trying to think of themselves as active participants in the political sphere, right? So in the white memoirs, when the army falls apart, that's chaos and dissolution, right? But when when Wildman writes about the army, then he's talking about the waves of democratization, that these soldiers, the soldiers who are there, these voiceless people, he's looking at their political imagination, right? And so people who worked on the peasantry, these are not anarchist, crazy people who are destroying estates and torching estates. These are people who want to think of another way of living apart from feudal exploitation, right? So I would argue the social history is also then a political history. And most recently, Mark Steinberg has published a wonderful, wonderful book on the Russian Revolution, where he's talking about the revolution as lived experience, right? So it's not ideologies, it's not parties, it's not even social class, it's the experience of living through revolutionary times, right? And this emotional archive, the emotional economy of revolution, I would say is very important, right? Because many of us perhaps got into this field because we had some kind of political experience where we remember being on the street, right? Or we remember being part of a bigger organization. We remember horizontal space, not hierarchical space, right? And so I think this is a really, really useful way to understand. And there's one chapter in this book where he talks about being in the street, right? What did it mean to be on the streets of Petrograd, right? What did it mean when all the structures of authority are crumbling? What did it mean to participate in this dynamism, right? And it's a really brilliant book. And please feel free to ask me questions. I don't want to go on and on. So any point anybody wants to jump in and contradict me or ask a question, yes?
So what's the title of the book again?
I wish I could remember. It's a Russian Revolution, but it's Steinberg, Steinberg, Mark, and it came out with, oh my God, I want to say Oxford, but he's at Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. If you Google him, the book will come up. I don't know what we did before Google. I can't imagine life before Google. So if graduate students have any questions, please feel free to interrupt me. So now I will move to the cultural frame of analysis, right? And the cultural frame of analysis also goes back to people who were observers, participants in 1917. And so we have René Fuller-Miller, a German participant, and John Reed, this American who was there on the night of the attack on the Winter Palace, and whose book, 10 Days That Shook the World, is what became Soviet propaganda. So how absurd is it, right? That the Russians were using an American eyewitness news to sell its revolution to the world. And John Reed fell out of favor under Stalin, but by the 50s, the Russians were bringing out many, many versions of the book, and it's still on the world bookseller list. And so Reed is one of the few foreigners who's buried behind the Kremlin wall. And his book is very interesting. Later he became a Bolshevik sympathizer, but at the time he was writing the book, he's much more interested in what's happening on the streets. He's much more interested in the cafes where there's no food, but people are talking. In the theaters where there's no electricity, but these brilliant ballerinas are performing, right? And he's so interested in the revolutionary poetry. And so his approach is very close to what Steinberg, but Steinberg also sees the dark side, right? So Reed came from, he'd just seen the Mexican Revolution in Mexico. And so this was a man who was looking for revolution, right? He was bored with bourgeois life. So he goes from Mexico, where not much is happening, and he goes to Petrograd. What a fabulous place to be, right? If you're a young man looking for adventure. Now, this cultural approach to the Russian Revolution was really not explored because we were so obsessed with what did Lenin say, what did Lenin do, where was Stalin? Why wasn't Stalin there, right? Like our obsession with these party leaders. So the cultural approach was really completely undervalued. In 1989, Richard Stites, a really maverick Russian scholar that some of you know, right? And Stites, if the line was straight, Stites always walked on the side, right? He didn't take American academia very seriously, and he was I think he's one of the few free spirits I've met in my life, right? He didn't accept, I think he was an anarchist, he didn't accept any authority, which is why he was so brilliantly creative, right? And he publishes this book called Revolutionary Dreams. And in the book, he's talking about that throughout history, Russians have dreamt about equality and freedom, right? And justice, right? So very important. So he's talking about the fact that the Bolsheviks are this little blip, right? There's this stream of humanity that's been thinking about freedom, equality, and justice, and the Bolsheviks happen in this river, right? So the Bolsheviks are not inventing these slogans. These are things that the Russian peasantry have been grieving about for a very long time, right? And in his book, he looks at the way that this dream of radical equality, right? So for Stites, revolution is, the only thing is revolutionary is, can we make radical equality a living instantiation, right? So how do we make radical equality work for people like us, right? Can everyday life be reconfigured on the basis of radical equality, right? Can you have an orchestra where you don't have a conductor, right? Can you have a conductorless orchestra, right? Can you have a school where there's no teachers and students? Can you have architecture which is not dedicated to celebrating money and capitalism, right? Can you have equality in art? Can you have equality in science fiction? It's truly a philosophical book, right? It's not, I mean, he happens to base it on the Russian Revolution, but Stites is very interested in this idea, and of course, you know, he was a product of the 60s, in this idea of radical equality as lived phenomena, right? And the book was very interesting, you know, when it was published, a lot of people, right? John Bolt, Katrina Clark, Christina Keir, James von Gelden, I can go on and on. Many people tried to explore the impact of the revolution in the arts, in theater, in film, in literature, in architecture, in communal living. Recently I met Andrew Wilmot, a young British scholar, who wrote his book on communal living, right? Where students were trying to live together and even share underwear, right? To sort of inhabit this radical selflessness, right? Can I really inhabit somebody else's being? And the only way I can do it if I can let go of my own ego, right? And so I just met Andy Wilmot, and I was telling him it's such an interesting book. And so Stites' influence, the book, a lot of us, I was a young graduate student when the book came out, and I just remember being electrified and saying, okay, this is the kind of history I want to do, right? But the big names in the fields didn't take that book very seriously because, you know, Stites was seen as this, a sort of, you know, this maverick, you know, this guy did his own thing. I'm sorry? You met him? He was, I mean, and he could be very odd in many ways, right? But the book has had real staying power, right? Because I think now the second generation of graduate students are drawn to that book. And so the whole notion as October, not just a political rupture, but a cultural rupture, right? The whole notion that socialist realism wasn't the only thing that came out of the Bolshevik Revolution, but there were many, many other imaginations that were let loose, right? Vladimir Paperny's, you know, brilliant book, Kultura Dva, right, where he talks about the whole notion of the revolution in architecture. So this is another very rich way to understand the revolution. The other frame that has become very important is the Imperial Frame, right? So for a long time, we thought of Russia as a nation, a people, a language, right? an ethno-national group, but in the last 15, 20 years, becoming increasingly clear that Russia is first and foremost an empire, right? And Russia, the Russians were barely 50% of the population, right? This was truly a multi-confessional, multi-ethnic empire, right? So this privileging of Russians was actually very bad history, because in reality Russia was this the space all the way from Europe to Asia, right? Composed of a most bewildering number of nationalities, from the small peoples of the north, right, to the Caucasus, right, to one of the largest Muslim populations, to Central Asia, and Russia is of course drawing on this Western heritage. So when you think of Russia as an empire, the whole notion of Russia changes, right? And Geoffrey Hoskins in England played a very important role in hammering home this point. It's not Russia, it's the Russian Empire, right? So to bring the imperial frame back to 1917, some of the earlier works looked at, so for example, Ron Tsouni, he looked at, well, the Bolshevik Revolution took place in Petrograd and Moscow, but what happened in the Caucasus, right? What happened in Armenia? What happened in Georgia? So this was looking at the effects of the imperial breakdown at the periphery. But more recently, and some of you might have read his book, Joshua Sanborn wrote a very interesting book where he's using the post-colonial term of decolonization, and he's applying it to Soviet history, right? So he's talking about the fact that why do we only use decolonization for the West European empires, right, in Asia and Latin America? If anything, 1917 was the first example of decolonization, right? So he's looking at how the peripheries, the collapse of the peripheries actually led to the collapse of the center, right? So he's looking at the role of Ukraine, of Poland, of Central Asia, right? And so he's changing the narrative, turning it on its head. And of course, as you can imagine, there's a lot of resistance to his political approach, but it's actually, I think, very useful. And I also want to talk a little bit about Adib Khalid and Ali Iman, who have also argued against this center and the periphery, to saying, wait a minute, Moscow is not just telling the peripheries what to do. So Adib Khalid has been looking at the Muslim intelligentsia in Central Asia, the Jadid movement, and he's finding that there is an intellectual class who want modernization, right? And the Soviet Union is their way to get to Western modernity, right? So these are not primitive peoples that the Soviet Union is saying become modern. These are an intellectual class that are highly receptive to Western modernity before the latter, right? So these are very important new work. And finally, Marianne Camp has written one of the best books on Uzbekistan, and she's very interested in not what Moscow did to Uzbek women, but how Uzbek women saw the revolution, right? So changing the gaze, right? Because history seems to adopt this male central gaze, right? We all do history as if we were men, powerful men, right? That is the view of history, right? But when you change that gaze and say, well, you know, how do marginal people look at history? That has the power actually to change history, right? And I think that's important to remember. So now we've gone through the four themes, right? The political, the social, the cultural, and the imperial. Do I have any questions before I get to the global approach?
Just one additional remark about this Russian immigrants, the anti-Soviet stance. Actually, it was they were just anti-Soviet, but not anti-Russian.
No.
But if you have a look at Polish scholars working on Russian history, they were both anti-Soviet and anti-Russian, right? The Richard Pipes and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Yeah. So I think that these Polish experts on Russian history, their role is very important especially when considering this alliance between the American anti-Russian American foreign policy and then those immigrants. But they were actually Russian Jewish and Polish Jewish immigrants who were deprived of their capital after the system after the Second World War, and so this is, I think.
And Ji-Hoon is absolutely right, and this is so important to recognize, and I was hurrying a little bit, I didn't want to get too much, but it's very important, right, because the Polish and the emigres were anti-Soviet, they were pro-Russian, they were hardcore Russian nationalists. These people, and Martin Melia is again very interesting, right, the way that he writes and wrote and continued to write. It's a great point, Ji-Hoon. Okay, so then, yes?
So how do you make a distinction between social approach and cultural approach? Because both approaches seem to focus on lived experiences of the person.
And so Boris Kalonitsky's work, it's right, you're right, it's absolutely a social cultural approach, right? And so with the cultural approach, I was really looking at the scholars who look at art, literature, film, and architecture. And so that's how I would define the cultural, right? But you have no idea how much historiography I'm covering, right? So if I'm making gross and horrible generalizations, please bear with me, right? Because if I want to get into any more detail, my talk would never end. But you're right, I mean, it is a continuum, right? A lot of people who were interested in social history used a cultural approach to social history, right? But there were some people who were only looking at Russian culture and how Russian culture changed after 1917. Any other? Yes?
Richard Pipes' work, Formation of Soviet Union, for
yes.
example, can it be classified to imperial category?
Your points. You're absolutely right, and even Mark Steinberg has a whole chapter on imperial, right? And so these are heuristic devices, right? I was trying to make it useful, my talk, to graduate students, and you're absolutely right. So in many places my argument breaks down, right? But we all have to do a little bit of simplification because there are something like 20,000 books on the Russian Revolution, right? And when I was preparing this talk, I was really going a little bit crazy, and so I was thinking, okay, let me try and make it useful, and maybe later somebody can pick apart my generalization. You're absolutely right, because Richard Pipes, of course, sees the Soviet Union as a continuity of the Russian Empire, right? He thinks nothing changes. They were crazy, they were authoritarian, they were evil then, and they are crazy, authoritarian, and evil, right? So, but this is very much Cold War thinking of Russia as enemy. Okay, so now for the global analysis, right? And this is something, and I will go through not just my work, I will go through some other people who have pioneered the global approach, and then we can have a discussion of, does it add anything to our understanding of the event? So for many centuries, Russian history has been traditionally studied as a geographical and imaginative space in need of military and ideological containment. And I talked a little bit about this yesterday, where this really came out of the struggle between the British and the Russian Empire, who were both expanding very quickly in the Middle East and in Asia, and the British scholars came up with a set of ways to represent Russia as the other, as the enemy, and somehow make the distinction that where British imperialism was a good thing for the world, Russian imperialism was a very bad thing for the world, right? And so this is, the whole nuance of the civilizing mission, the British civilizing mission versus the Russian civilizing mission, it's a whole genre of Orientalism that I won't go into. So a world history approach then marks a significant departure from this historiographical tradition, which has now been well established. As early as the 16th century, Italian travelers to Russian Empire was talking about the fact that, they're backward, they're Asiatic, they have no freedom. So, this is, and sometimes when you keep saying something for 4 centuries, it becomes the truth, right? That's how history works. History is a very powerful discipline, right? And sometimes historical truths become so self-evident to us that we don't even challenge them, right? Because it becomes what is normal. The normal way of seeing the world is that the British Empire is good and the Russian Empire is bad. Who would be stupid enough to challenge something that is so obvious to everybody, right? So what we are trying to do is is then to set a new transnational and really trans-imperial research agenda for the Slavic studies in the 21st century, right? And it's very interesting. Some of my colleagues in Russia are very uncomfortable with this approach, right? Because they also believe in the Russian national essence, right? So some of them are, and even a colleague told me, are you guys not interested in Russia anymore? I mean, first everybody's interested in empire, and now global. So where's Russia and all this, right? And I hear some of those criticisms, right? Because if I hadn't been trained in Russian history, it wouldn't be possible to do this global and comparative work. Now, I must admit that this whole global approach is only possible because of this huge body of literature that we have, or what I talked about yesterday, is Russia under Western eyes, right? So the othering of Russia, and there's a wonderful book by Larry Wolff, who talks about how Europe, which had always been divided between the civilized Mediterranean Europe, right, the Roman legacy, and the barbaric north, right? And that Europe had always been divided south and north, and then after the Enlightenment, Europe became divided between the east and the west, right? And he's written this brilliant book of how this frame of analysis changes, right? So the Mediterranean world becomes irrelevant, to put it mildly. The major actors are, of course, England and France and Germany and the Netherlands, and then Eastern Europe is just about everybody else, right? And so Europe itself is reconfigured to contain Russia, right? So European history is being rewritten to contain Russia. Now, so we have this incredible body of scholarship, and then a few years ago, a friend of mine and I, we published a book called Russia and on Russian-American relations, because in the 20th century, this huge European literature was then overtaken by the American literature, which sort of kept this European approach to Russia. Russia as backward, Russia as authoritarian, Russia as non-democratic, right? And so the Americans took this over, and then it all fit very seamlessly into the totalitarian literature, right, that I started talking about. Now, very interestingly, in this approach, Russia was never compared to the European empires. Russia was always compared to England, to France, to Germany, to the Netherlands, right? So if you take a nation, so if it was compared to America, it was never compared to American empire, right? And so in a weird way, the Russian Empire was compared to Western nations, right? But, so what we are saying is, what if we compare the Russian Empire to European empires, right? Does that change the story, right? How do we bring back empire into Western European history, not as something forgotten, not as something separate, and this absurd notion that there can be a national history which has nothing to do with imperial history, right? So you could take a class in Victorian England and you can take a class in British Empire. Does that make sense? But you can't take the two classes together, right? And so this distinction was only possible because the European empires were overseas empires, right? Out of sight, out of mind, right? Who cares about the Philippines when you're in the United States, right? But Russian Empire was a contiguous empire, right? It was very visible that the peripheries of Russia were non-Russian nationalities, right? And so this is the approach that we are then trying to take. But within Russia and world history, there are, what I'm saying, three distinct approaches. And I want to talk about a few of them because I think they're important. How am I doing on time?
10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay. So the first is pioneered by Stephen Marx. He wrote a very important book in how Russia shaped the modern world. And he looks at the 20th century not as the Anglo-American century, but as the Russian century, right? So he sees the diffusion of Russian culture, art, anti-Semitism, political ideology, Soviet Marxism, and he sees its diffusion and reception in these different areas. And you know, it was again like Richard Steitz's book. It didn't get huge reception, but I think it's going to become increasingly important. Now, another approach that I think is very interesting is Kate Brown's book on Plutopia. I don't know if some of you have read it. She compares the nuclear industry in the United States and the Soviet Union and finds it's quite shocking that, both governments didn't care about the environmental impact. Both governments didn't really care about the health of the workers. Their approach was very similar. But what was even more shocking in her book is that American workers and Soviet workers were perfectly happy to live in radioactive zones as long as they got beautiful suburbias, nice homes, 3-car garages, and lots of money, right? So she's really talking about modernity and modernity and how we are completely oblivious to the incredible environmental damage, right? So Kate Brown, she's really blurring this American-Russian difference by looking at how we inhabit modernity in the 20th century. Now, Ji-Hun Lim, of course, has pioneered a brand new approach in global history, the 5 volumes that he did on mass dictatorships, and Paul is sitting right there, and many of us have participated, and this was really something quite new. No one had done this comparative mass politics, mass dictatorships, because it was always Soviet Union and Germany, right? So bringing in places like Korea and Italy, and there were some comparisons between Italian fascism, but very little. So that is a brand new approach. The Soviet Union had itself pioneered a methodology because of the Comintern. So the Communist International. So they really encouraged the publication of communist history. And recently, we've had a lot of interest in the Comintern with the opening of the Soviet archive. So Steve Smith at Oxford, Silvio Pons in Italy, the Oxford Histories of Communism and the Cambridge Histories of Communism. These are another way to understand the global approach. So what are we doing that is so different? So one of the things that we are doing is we're getting away from this world of communism, right? So instead of just containing it to communism, we're looking at the broader impact on individuals and the individuals. So some of the articles have to do with Comintern activists, right? Some of them are also about national communist parties, but a lot of the articles have to do with communism as a global force, and a lot of the articles have to do with people who didn't fall into this Cold War binary, right? Who were neither pro-Soviet Union nor were they pro-United States, right? So this is a way we're trying to come up with another way to understand the 20th century. Some of the articles, for example, and I'll talk about Ji-Hun, because Ji-Hun is looking at how Asian colonized countries looked at Soviet modernity as an alternative to Western modernity, right? But he shows that in this search, the Soviet ideals of liberty and equality was completely destroyed, and it became this sort of twisted, wounded nationalism, right? So then the Soviet Union wasn't a beacon for a liberation theology, it just became another way for colonized countries to become great. So that's a different way of looking about it. 5 more minutes? No. Okay. So we have scholars writing from Indonesia, from Brazil, from Peru, from Latin America, from Africa, from the Middle East, right? Places where we traditionally don't have scholarship on the impact of the Russian Revolution. And some of these people are also very interested in the other voices of October, right? Not just Lenin and Stalin, but the many, many, many other democratic voices of October, which I think is very important. Now, in conclusion, why do we care about 1991 today? I mean, 1917 today, right? Why is it still relevant? Why are we having this workshop, right? Is it just history? Is it just historiography? And so I just want to say is that even though communism, Soviet-style communism has collapsed, I'm going to argue that there's a very rich philosophical and intellectual tradition that comes out of the left, which I think is very, very pertinent today. And instead of thinking about this opposition, right, again, this is a Cold War ideology, capitalism and communism, right? What if we, instead of thinking about them as opposite systems, we think of them as hybrid systems, right? Because there was cross-fertilization all the time. I mean, European social democracy was what? It was a cross-fertilization of the free market together with Russian ideas about the welfare state, right? And so these kind of cross-fertilizations might be a more productive way to think instead of this triumphalism, 1991, we buried communism, there's nothing to be learned, now we can enter the brand new world of global capitalism, right? And so I don't want to live in a world where there's only a monologue. I think it's always very fruitful to inhabit a world of many, many voices. And so I'll just end with the fact that, you know, I'm very interested in the millennial generation and their politics, because I frankly feel a lot of hope when I'm with young people. And it seems to me that from Occupy Wall Street, right, which became a global phenomenon, right, to the recent discussions that we've had about universal basic income, which came out of Silicon Valley, right, because of disruptive technologies, this whole notion that everybody should be guaranteed a basic income, to the modern environmental movement, which really goes back to the ideas that Kropotkin came up with almost a century ago. There is no way to disentangle the left, right? And so whether Russian communism was a failure or not, I think that intellectual legacy, and you know, when I think of post-colonial criticism, I look at world systems theory, I look at dependency theory, you can see the intellectual lineages of the left in every part of academia, right? And now it's very interesting that even from the heartland of capitalism, in America, there are these new ideas about inclusive capitalism, right? So what is inclusive capitalism? Last time I checked, it was social democracy, right? It was good old social democracy, right? And so I think this wonderful conversation that we've been having for many centuries will continue. And my hope is that in the 21st century, we will again think of transnational horizontal spaces, right? Because this pyramid approach to human societies, I don't think is working very well. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Choi, for your wonderful mapping of the studies of Russian Revolution and nowadays. And then we're going to go back to the discussion in the roundtable discussion, so we're going to have more chances to talk over your talk. And then I'd like to invite our second speaker, Paul Kono, who is Senior Fellow Advisor at the University of Siena, and he's a founding director of the Institute of Studies of Totalitarianism in Italy. So, Paul?
Well, I was given strict instructions not to go beyond half an hour. So this made me a bit shocked.
I think it's a right interpretation of history.
Well, my job is to talk about fascism, Italian fascism and the Russian Revolution, which in some ways might seem to be a very, very short talk, because the two would seem to be at opposite poles to each other. Let me begin by reminding you, and I think it's necessary to do this very often, that Italian fascism actually came to power in October of 1922, 5 years after the Russian Revolution. So there's no immediate response to the Russian Revolution from the part of fascism. However, what happens in 1917 is very important for what fascism will think about the Russian Revolution. In this sense, the October Revolution coincides with a massive defeat of the Italian armies in the First World War, in a battle. It's a battle which goes on for several days, battle which is known as Caporetto. Caporetto is, as I say, a massive defeat for the Italian armies, largely due to the incompetence of the generals. And as a result, it distracts attention from what's going on in the rest of the world. The Italians are too concerned about their own situation. It looks as though the Austrians get to within 20 miles of Venice. It looks as though Italy may have to withdraw from the war. Caporetto, incidentally, has become a sort of synonym for a total disaster. If Italians want to talk about a total disaster, they say this is a caporetto, and the phrase has been used often in the last week. As those of you who are interested in football may have noticed. Now, what is significant about this is that the Italian government, looks for a scapegoat. It has to find somebody who is responsible for this defeat. And who does it point to? It points to the Italian Socialist movement. Now, the Italian Socialist movement has been neutralist throughout the course of the war. The Italian Socialist movement is one of the very few socialist movements in Europe which didn't vote war credits in 1914. I think the only other country where war credits were not voted was Serbia. So the Italian socialists have always been against the war. They've always said the war is useless, pointless. They've always said that the war is simply a war between competing capitalisms. Now, the government uses this position to say the defeat at Caporetto has been caused by what they call defeatism, nurtured by Italian socialism, which has got into the army, and therefore the army has lacked the desire to fight against the Austrians. It all becomes the fault of the socialists. The socialists are termed, are called an internal enemy, undermining the war effort from within. And after Caporetto, there is what is really a hysterical right-wing witch hunt against Italian socialists. Many of them are arrested and put in prison. These people are in fact, from this moment, accused of having undermined the war effort, as I say. They're condemned because they're defeatist, because they're unpatriotic, because they're internationalists. They are told that they are simply not Italian. They don't love Italy, and therefore they have no right to be Italian. So, massive onslaught on Italian socialism at this moment. How does this fit in with the Russian Revolution? Now, the revolution, as I say, passes relatively unnoticed because of this drama which is taking place within Italy. From the reports which we see of prefects and the police in October and November, what do the ordinary people think about the Russian Revolution? It's very interesting. Obviously, when they hear the word revolution, what do they think about? They think about the only thing they know which has a revolution in its name, which is the French Revolution. And they think this is going to start again. So they're all saying, oh great, you know, we're going to go, what the phrase they use all the time is going to cut off the heads of the gentlemen. This is their image of revolution. But they don't really know very much about what's going on in Russia. The main reaction to the Russian Revolution is concern that Russia will pull out of the war, which of course eventually does occur. Concern that Russia will pull out of the war, and this will release German soldiers from the Russian front who will come and fight against the Italians. That's the main concern. Now, one of the most outspoken, this is where we get to fascism, one of the most outspoken leaders of the witch hunt against Italian socialism is Benito Mussolini. Now, Mussolini, and it's worth remembering this, Mussolini, up until 1914, has been one of the leaders of the Italian Socialist Party. He's been the editor of the main socialist newspaper, Avanti. He's converted to intervention in the war between 1914 and 1915, and like many converts, he becomes one of the most vitriolic opponents of socialism, having passed to the other side, to the nationalist side. Now, as I say, Mussolini is one of the leaders of this hysterical witch hunt against socialism in 1917. And in a sense, Mussolini's anti-socialism is born at this moment. If you want to understand why Italian fascism is so anti-socialist, it's because of what happens during the First World War, what happens in 1917. Only sort of vaguely linked to the revolution itself. It's linked principally to the prospect of national defeat. Now, here you have a distinction between what is going on within Italy and what's going on the broader European scene. And this is a useful distinction, I think, for seeing what happens in later years, during the 20 years of fascist rule. Now, of course, as you all know, fascism in the early years in particular distinguishes itself for anti-socialist, anti-communist. The Communist Party is formed in January of 1921. Distinguishes itself for anti-socialist, anti-communist actions. The fascist black shirt squads spend all their time beating socialists over the head, killing them, murdering them. Between 1920 and 1922, at the end of 1922, at least 3,000 Italian socialists are murdered by the fascists. Many more socialists are forced to go into exile. Only recently I was reading, I found a pack of essays written by students in the 1970s. And the teacher had asked them to ask their grandparents what was their memory of fascism. And it was striking how many of these students said, and my grandfather, who was a socialist, was told that he had to leave the province and had to go and find work elsewhere. And so they went to France, or they went to Switzerland, or something like this. You know, they're pushed into exile. So the anti-socialist idea, of fascism is very clear. The leaders of Italian socialism also go into exile, unless they're put in prison. The socialists tend to go to Paris, the communists tend to go to Moscow. Now, Italian socialism is really defeated in the course of the 1920s. By the time you get to the end of the 1920s, there's really no opposition to fascism. It's sometimes said, in fact, that in 1938, when Italian fascism introduces the racial laws, the anti-Semitic racial laws, that Mussolini does this because he needs a new internal enemy. The socialists are no longer functioning as a focus for hostility to the internal enemy, and so he picks on the Jews, hoping that it'll have the same function. Now, having said that, here we have fascism, which murders communists. It might seem there's little more to say. Fascists killed, imprisoned, exiled, repressed socialists and communists. Now, presumably, these actions and attitudes reflected their view of the Russian Revolution. Now, this is not precisely the case. This is a rather surprising thing about the attitude of fascism to the Russian Revolution. Very, very briefly, you could say that Italian Bolsheviks are one thing for fascism, Russian Bolsheviks are another. And the distinction is made very clearly. In fact, Mussolini at a certain point says, Russian Bolsheviks can do what they like, I don't care about this, just as long as Italian Bolsheviks don't do anything. So he makes this decision. In fact, I think we have to understand that the hatred of Italian socialism did not extend to the socialism of the Bolshevik Revolution. And if we want to see evidence of this, we can see that immediately Mussolini comes to power in October of 1922. His first government, at the beginning of 1924, recognizes the Soviet Union, and it's one of the first European governments to do so. During the course of the 1920s, in fact, relations between Russia, the Soviet Union, and Italian fascism are very good. There are very strong commercial links developing during the course of the 1920s. The Italians build a series of factories in the Soviet Union. There's a very big factory for ball bearings, which is built by the Italians. Trade is encouraged. There are exchanges between trade delegations. The Italians sell quite a lot of military aircraft to the Soviets in the course of the 1920s. There's a very interesting visit by Italo Balbo, one of the leading fascists, who's the man who sets up effectively the Italian Air Force in the course of the 1920s and the 1930s. Italo Balbo goes to Odessa on a kind of state visit in 1929, and he's received with great honour, and he and his fellow pilots, he goes with a series of aircraft, and that this visit of Balbo to Russia is reciprocated, it's returned by Russian pilots in 1934, when the Russians bring their planes into Rome and make a great demonstration of, this is hailed as being something which is very positive. Here are our friends, the Russians, showing us their skills in their planes. And when they leave, this is again highly significant, it seems to me, they circle Piazza Venezia in Rome, which is where Mussolini is living, 5 times before they make off towards the Soviet Union. So you have this picture, this strange picture, that ideologically the Russians are opposed, it would seem, but at a pragmatic level, the two regimes seem to get on quite well with each other. And in fact, I think, much of this activity is dictated by strategic and diplomatic considerations, and not by ideological considerations. Italian fascism is revisionist in Europe, of course. It looks for allies where it can find them. The Soviet Union can be useful there. The Soviet Union is also useful in blocking the possibility of German expansion in the Balkans. After the First World War, the Italians have great hopes of being able to expand economically in the Balkan area, the area of the Danube, lower Danube. And they fear that they're in competition with Germany here, and so their hope is that the Russians will in some way prevent the Germans from expanding. As I think I've said before last week, it's notable that Mussolini always has a great respect for Stalin. When you read his speeches, Mussolini talks about Churchill, he talks about Roosevelt, but he always talks about Mr. Stalin. There's always this phrase, Mr. Stalin, which shows that he has a great respect for his fellow dictator. So there's a kind of permissive attitude to the USSR, an ambiguous attitude. One of the factors which is very important is that the Russian Revolution is a revolution. And fascism presents itself as a revolution. So they are twin revolutions in a way. They may be very different, but they are revolutions. And that commands respect in Italy. The fascists like to think that they're on the same level as the Russians in terms of being revolutionary. And they notice all sorts of things that make it seem that the revolution in Italy has some of the same factors, same features as the Russian Revolution. You know, fascism presents itself as being the new order against the old order. You know, that fits in very well with the Russians. It presents itself as being the young against the old, the pure against the corrupt, all these sort of things, which, you know, they can find similarities with Russia. They rather like the Russian Revolution because they see it as being the victory of a militant minority against the majority. And fascism always prides itself on having been born from a very small minority, a very small group of people, which then takes over power. So they can find these elements which seem to bring them together in some way. They find resonance in fascist analysis of the October Revolution. People notice, obviously, that the choreography of the two movements is similar. The organisation of politics under the rule of the single party. They note that the Russians promised the formation of a new Soviet man, and fascism, of course, spends all its time talking about the new fascist man. This idea that there's going to be an anthropological revolution springing from the two orders. Both revolutions invoke a kind of palingenesis, based on very different criteria, obviously, but leading to a rapid achievement of modernity. Both of them are looking forward to creating a new society, which is going to be a modern society. We should also note, I think, that in cultural terms, there are very strong links between Italy and Russia, particularly in the first half of the 1920s. Italian futurism, for instance, has many significant exponents in the, or futurism has many significant exponents in the early years of the Soviet Union. Now, in some ways, of course, there are also ideological commonalities. You know, one has to remember, I think, and it is too often forgotten, that totalitarianism is an Italian invention. Mussolini was very proud of this fact, that the word, actually it was invented by an opponent of his, Giovanni Amendola, who said very early on in the 1920s, what kind of a society we're going towards. We're going towards a society which is totalitarian. Mussolini liked this phrase, and he took it, and he said, yes, let's do that. Let's create a totalitarian society. And what did this mean? It meant that everybody should be involved in the state. The great dictum of Mussolini is everything within the state, nothing outside the state. Now, the role of the state in respect of the individual is obviously in some ways similar. In the sense that the state is seen as dominating, and the individual achieves worth and value in as far as the individual is part of the collective represented by the state. So there are certain ideas here related to what is called the organic state, which seem to bring the two regimes together, I think. Now, it's obvious that in Italy, the key word is not equality, it's hierarchy. at the same time, both regimes are trying to remove the distinction between public and private, in the sense that the private should no longer exist, but should flow into the public. What is the general? At least in theory. Of course, what actually happens under fascism is the opposite: is that you take public power and you use it for private gain. But the theory is the other way around. It is that your private life should be totally absorbed in the public sphere. And it's quite clear that fascism had always attempted to defend private property. However, even here, there is a moment when fascism begins to, in the second half of the 1930s, when fascism begins to talk about what is called an anti-bourgeois campaign. The idea that a militant fascist shouldn't be bourgeois. Bourgeois is understood in terms of bourgeois comforts. The phrase which is actually used in Italian is that there's an attack on the people who wear bedroom slippers all day, giving the idea of a comfortable life that these people have, the people who sit in armchairs and wear slippers all day. These are the people fascism has to attack. They're too comfortable. These are the people who are taking away the dynamism from fascism. And therefore, it extends to sort of material comforts as well. So even within fascism, towards the end of the 1930s, you have this attack on material comforts, to the extent that in some circles you have the development of what has been referred to as a left-wing fascism. And Mussolini has to make declarations saying, no, we don't want left-wing fascism. And he refers to it as red fascism, fascismo rosso, meaning red in terms of communist. So you have an interesting connection there. Now, other points which in some senses bring the regime together. The big selling point of fascism in the 1930s at an international level is the cooperative state. This idea that you can run a society by forming 27 corporations, and that everybody in society will be put into one of these corporations according to the job they do, and that these corporations will work in harmony with each other. And what does this represent? This represents a way forward of organising society which is neither capitalist nor communist. Mussolini had been very impressed by the first 5-year plan in the Soviet Union and by the degree of economic development, economic progress which the Soviet Union was realizing. And he tries to work some kind of state organization of the economy into the fascist system during the course of the 1930s. There are state holding companies are formed in the 1930s. The corporations themselves are never formed. They're never formed basically because the industrialists and the large landowners don't want to see people organised. You know, what they say is, look, we've spent the first half of the 1920s destroying the trade unions. What we're doing with the corporations, in effect, is setting up some things which might be like the trade unions. So you don't actually have the formation of the corporations, but you do have a lot of talk about the role of the state in the running of the economy. Now, Italian fascism, Mussolini spends much more time denouncing plutocratic capitalism because his real enemies are, he sees as France and Britain, than he does denouncing communism. As a result, you find that both regimes, communist and fascist, tend to be using the same kind of rhetoric. Anti-capitalist rhetoric. You know, the argument in the 1930s is that capitalism is in crisis, capitalism is finished. Mussolini keeps on pointing to the unemployed in Britain and the United States, the evils of capitalism. You know, this kind of argument. Fascism, of course, being extremely clever at hiding its own unemployment, its own unemployment levels. But the rhetoric does tend to persuade some people that there are affinities between the two regimes. Despite all the rhetoric about anti-communism, that it's a question of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, this kind of thing. Mussolini is looking for allies at this point, and in some respects, people do say that the Soviet Union has many points of contact with Italian fascism. A phrase which is used, which I think is a very significant phrase in the 1930s, is that both Soviet communism and Italian fascism offer alternative roads to modernity. And the fascists, of course, say our alternative road to modernity is the best road, because it's a road which doesn't go for capitalism, it doesn't go for communism. What they say is we have overtaken capitalism and communism. We are moving forward in a new way which will leave both capitalism and communism aside. Having said that, I think it is very notable that there is this kind of latent admiration for the Soviet Union, which is in some ways emotional rather than ideological, it seems to me. It's very much related to the fact that we are both revolutionary powers trying to find new ways forward. Now, as I say, Italian fascism, Mussolini in particular, has a good relation with the Soviet Union until about 1935. What really destroys this relationship is the Spanish Civil War. Now, the Spanish Civil War is, of course, you probably know that there's a large number of volunteers from Italy, 50,000 soldiers sent to fight on the side of General Franco. Now, the justification for Italian intervention in the Spanish Civil War is purely ideological. It is we are fighting communism, we are trying to turn back the tide of communism in Europe, and so on and so on. It's a massive anti-Bolshevik campaign in Italy. It's painted as a crusade against communism. Remember, of course, that Italy houses the Vatican. The Vatican is anti-communist, obviously. Bishops bless the soldiers as they are leaving for Spain. And at the same time, we're beginning to get news of the purges in Moscow. So there's a lot of material which is going into anti-communism at this point. However, once again, first of all, people don't believe this ideological campaign. Ordinary people don't believe the ideological campaign. It's notable that at this point people are beginning to have radios in the 1930s in Italy. Remember that Italy is a backward country, 60% of the population living in agriculture. People are beginning to have radios. Some of them are provided by the fascists. What do they do with the radios? They listen to Radio Barcelona, which gives them the news about the civil war and what's happening, and undermines the rhetoric of the regime. The most significant divergence from the official line comes from students. The second half of the 1930s sees the emergence in Italy of a second generation of fascists. People who have been born under fascism or who've grown up under fascism and haven't known anything else. How do these people react? Well, many of them want to go and fight in Spain. They take on the rhetoric. They say this is our chance to prove that fascism is dynamic, and this is our chance to be part of the new movement. But there are quite a lot of young students who actually move away from fascism in this moment, in a certain sense. What they see in Italy at this point, increasingly in the second half of the 1930s, is an increase in injustice in society. They're very, very conscious of the fact that the working class living conditions of the working class are getting worse in the second half of the 1930s. They're very conscious of the fact that fascism, although in rhetorical terms it says it's going to meet the people, it never actually does. They're very conscious of the fact that fascism has become an increasingly corrupt regime, with local fascist officials using public power in order to fill their pockets. So the students react against this. And how do they react against it? They react against it by looking towards the Soviet regime, by taking their inspiration, in a sense, from the Russian Revolution. Students go into factories in the late 1930s and begin to talk to the workers about organising, about protest. Actually, they're doing this not because they're anti-fascist, but because they say they want to build a better fascism. They say fascism is on the decline, it's stagnating. Fascism has simply become a question of flag waving in the public square every now and then. One of the big words which is used at this time about fascism is that it's just become a question of exterior performances, exteriorità, external performances, that the fascist regime doesn't actually care what people think. These students actually want to create a new fascism, a new dynamic fascism in a way, but they want to do it by importing some of the things which they find from the Soviet Union. Now, many of these are middle-class students, of course, students being, at this point, by definition, middle-class. And many of them are hauled into police stations and warned and said, you know, you must stop this kind of propaganda to the workers. It's dangerous. The workers may get ideas which we don't want them to have. But it's interesting that these students, in fact, begin to look in a way towards the left in an attempt to reform fascism. Now, I want to finish. I don't want to emphasize this ambiguity of Italian fascism too much. Italy still has a king and a Vatican, both factors pushing in a very conservative direction. It's clear that the attempts for some people to move left within Italian fascism can't go too far. Mussolini would never permit this to happen because it threatens the people who are the backbone of fascism. I see I've written here that the working class is never convinced of fascism. It's interesting to note that the working class clearly does absorb some of the propaganda of fascism. because when the Italian soldiers go to Russia, go to the Ukraine in the Second World War, they are very surprised by what they find, because they write letters home saying, these Russian peasants are actually quite well off. You know, they seem to be doing quite well. They have tractors. You know, they're very envious of the fact, and they realise that this is a very interesting moment, in fact. They realise that the propaganda about the Soviet Union, which the official fascist propaganda about the Soviet Union, has been a pack of lies. And this surprise is so strong among the soldiers that the officers write back and say, we have great fears about the Bolshevization of what they call the Bolshevization of the Italian army in the Soviet Union. However, on the whole, I think the workers, even if they absorb the propaganda about the Soviet Union, they certainly are not in favour of fascism. They remember the early 1920s far too much. Now, there is no conclusion to this in a sense, but I just say that it's interesting to note that two mass dictatorships, which apparently ideologically so opposed to each other, do seem to find some common ground in terms of methods of political organisation and regimentation, and in a very, very general sense in terms of aspirations towards the future, alternative modernities. Now, what I'm not suggesting here is that extremes meet, because the ultimate objectives of fascism and communism are obviously very different. But it is to suggest the not very surprising conclusion that, confronted by all the problems represented by the organisation and regimentation of a mass society, regimes of a very different political orientation will sometimes find themselves treading the same road. And they'll see that they're treading the same road, and as I say, maybe they'll nod to each other along the way.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. While you were speaking, I got the news that we have our own caporetto. Instead, our second discussant informed us she can't join us because she is hospitalized.
Okay.
But on the other hand, our caporetto is a little bit slightly different because it means that we're going to have some more minutes for discussion. So, I mean, if you have just simple questions to this host, the talk, just I can get a couple of very simple questions, and then serious, discussion will be made in the round table discussion. But if you have just checked certain factual things or very simple ones, please don't hesitate.
Who's going to decide whether it's a simple question?
It's a dictator.
I have a simple, possibly factual question, which is about Mussolini's relationship with the church and how they viewed Russian atheism or Russian anti-religion campaigns. And maybe that's not a small question.
No.
Did that get in the way of appreciating the Russian way, or the Soviet way, I should say?
Mussolini himself was always anti-religious, but he needed the support of the Catholic Church in Italy, because so he's very careful right from the beginning when he takes power to establish good relations with the Catholic Church. He makes schools put up the cross in schoolrooms and things like this, and he arrives at the agreement with the Vatican in 1929 with the Concordat and the Lateran Pacts. And it's the same story. Mussolini will denounce communism as atheistic. At the same time, he will become great friends of the Pope, or attempt to. So he tries to ride both horses in this sense. During the 1930s, it's a bit difficult to maintain good relations with the Vatican always, because there's a competition for the control of young people, schools. The Fascists want the young people to go into fascist organisations. The church wants them to go into Catholic organisations. And they do quarrel about that during the course of the 1930s. But fundamentally, the church is very happy with fascism. It's very happy with fascism because it likes what it calls an ordered society. And it likes a state which seems to be giving concessions to the Vatican, or which is giving concessions to the Vatican in terms of education in particular. This is the main thing. So when the troops leave for Ethiopia in 1935, the bishops are all there to bless the soldiers as they leave, and the same in 1936 when they go to Spain. The only signs there are that there's an increasing division between the church and fascism is in 1938 in response to the racial laws. But even there, the denunciation which the Pope is preparing of the racial laws never appears because the Pope dies. And there's never any clear denunciation of anti-Semitism by the Vatican in 1938 or 1939.
Okay. Is there any simple question?
This is simple. It's so simple that I should know the answer because I used to teach this stuff. Is there no threat of red revolution between 1917 and 1922?
Oh yes.
Yeah. So that, I mean that's in the mix.
That should be, yes, I should say this, of course. Now, there is what is called the two red years, 1919 and 1920, when the socialist movement at the end of the war, because it's been neutralist, because it's said the war is useless and pointless, the socialist movement becomes very strong. Now, it's not true to say that fascism is a response to that, because the socialist movement itself declines of its own momentum, and the fascist movement takes advantage of this decline in order to basically dismantle the socialist movement. But yeah, I mean the textbooks always say fascism developed as a threat to, as a response to the threat of red revolution. If you look at it day by day, this is actually not true. What you can see is that you can see a right-wing movement forming during the course of the First World War, which is unhappy about the way in which the Italian state is dealing with the problem of mass politics, and is working out strategies during the course of the war, which will then become effective in 1920 and 1921. So there is actually a separate line which brings Italy towards fascism. It's not just a sort of reaction to what happens in 1919 and 1920. If you look at some of the declarations made by people after the defeat of Caporetto, when people are really terrified, what they are saying then, the nationalists, is we should shoot the socialists, and particularly the socialist leaders. So the idea at that point that violence should be used against, I mean, violence has always been used against the opposition in United Italy from the beginning, but the idea that the state should employ violence against the socialists, and if the state doesn't do it, which is what happens in 1920, then we will do it. And we'll take over the state. That's what happens.
Okay, thank you. And then now is 3:15, and we're gonna have about 15 minutes for break. So 3:30, the second session will begin. Thank you.